Hello everyone, Alpha Soul here and welcome to another video. Now this video is a little bit different from the other videos that I've been doing. This is all about why Ultima Online players are so excited for Ashes of Creation. Now, I was in guild chat the other day and we were just talking, not talking about anything in particular, and started talking about old school games. And one of the people that I was talking to is actually aged 22. He's in his later college years at this point and is getting ready to graduate. And I realized, well, wait a second, Ultima Online was released 20, 21 years ago or so. You were basically a kid, and some of the younger people would not have been born when Ultima Online came out. So you may not understand or even realize what Ultima Online was to the older generation. And so I thought it would be a fun idea to do a video kind of explaining what Ultima Online was, what the Ashes of Creation design philosophy is and how it relates to Ultima Online, and what has a lot of us old school, MMO players really excited for Ashes of Creation. So that's kind of the genesis of this video. So with that, let's just go ahead and jump right into the video. Now, the first thing to mention is I'm going to be talking about this game in the past tense. Ultima Online is actually still out, and you can still connect to the servers, you can still go ahead and jump into the game, but it's not quite the same thing that it actually was before. So I'm going to be talking about it as if it's a dead game, because essentially kind of is, but that's a topic for another day. So that's just the kind of baseline here. Now, I personally have been gaming for quite a long time. Before Ultima Online came out, there was these things called MUDs, or multi-user dungeons. I got into MUDs when I was about, 13 years old or something like that. And I remember going down to my cousin's house in Jamaica, and we, we're talking, conversing, and he introduced me to MUDs. And the specific MUD that I was in was Nanny MUD, that was run out of this Licetur.lu college. I think it was based in Sweden. But anyways, it's a graphical kind of representation of, RPG games. You can go in, you type, go north, press enter, and your character goes north, and there's all this text that kind of comes down and explains what's going on. So it's something that you read. And so roughly around 1997, when I was like 16, 17 years old, I started getting wind of the beta for what was Ultima Online, which would be essentially the first graphical MMORPG. Now, MMORPGs, it technically wasn't the first. There was Meridian 59. However, Meridian 59 was a little bit different. It was more like a graphical MUD rather than more a graphical online game, if you will. And Meridian 59 also had other things, like it was incredibly expensive to play just because of the pricing structure. You had to pay for AOL, and then on top of that, Meridian 59. So it was, a little bit more cost prohibitive on that. So Ultima Online was essentially offering more. It was, a true kind of world that it would be in. So I was like, excellent, this is exactly what I am looking for. Now, there's a very interesting article that if you have time and if it interests you, I would highly encourage you to go ahead, feel free, check it out. What it is essentially a Wired article that was released in, I believe, 1998, May or something like that of 1998, whereas Ultima Online was released in September of 1997. So it came out after, and it kind of does this nice summary. Really interesting read, highly encourage you to read it, but let's keep going. Now, Ultima Online is widely regarded as the grand social experiment, and you can actually see that from the Wired article. They kind of mention it as well too. It had a lot of kind of features. Today, you would really categorize it as a sandbox MMO. It was a game that you were put into the world, essentially naked and afraid with nothing on you, and you kind of had to figure out what you wanted to do, what you wanted to be. There were many things that you could do. You could be a lumberjack, you could be a tailor, you could be a blacksmith, you could be a tamer, you could be a warrior, you could be a fighter, a mage. There were so many things that you could do, and it was a skill-based system. So there weren't classes, there weren't levels. You essentially would level up or improve on skills based on use. So if you wanted to get better at being a mage, then you casted a ton of spells. If you wanted to get better at swordsmanship, then you picked up the sword and swung away on different creatures, right? Things of that nature. So it was really a skill-based system with a max cap of 700 for skills. So you could really customize what kind of character that you wanted to be and what you actually wanted to do. Ultima Online had a housing system. It had a system where you could easily go in, build your house, purchase enough for a deed, and place your house essentially almost anywhere in the world that there was space. So you would see villages kind of crop up and things of that nature. And it also had a karma system, which was essentially a system that would govern, kind of behavior. Its intention was to govern behavior. So if you did bad deeds, you would, essentially go red and be attackable by any player. You can go in towns, guards, NPCs would attack you on sight at a whim, basically. So there were quote unquote many downfalls for being having that karma go down, but you can also gain karma and essentially become, a good guy. So there were great lords and there were dread lords, and it was all kind of a system that kind of worked itself out. So with that out of the way, I want us to go ahead and talk about the 5 main pillars of Ashes of Creation and what they are striving for. Now, the first pillar is an engaging story. Engaging story is just that. What is your reason for being in the world, and what are you as a player going to do in that world, and how do you kind of fit into that whole thing? Ashes of Creation is really designed around creating a vibrant world, both player and NPC alike, that you can go ahead and interact with. The second pillar is being a reactive world. Reactive meaning, can you change the world? What happens when you go in? Is that world, always the same? You go here, there, you know exactly what to expect? Or does that world kind of change as things progress, as things go on in the world? Reactive world essentially means just that. How much of the world is, kind of changing and reacting to what players do. Now, the third pillar is player interaction. That essentially is how players kind of interact with one another, grouping up together, dealing with trading goods, and in general, just again, interacting with one another. The core principle that Ashes of Creation is kind of putting forward is they want player interaction to be a major thing. With a lot of the newer MMOs, player interaction has kind of gone to the wayside. You can do things by yourself. You don't even really have to talk to anyone to get a group. I don't even remember in World of Warcraft the past 50 groups, anyone from the past 50 groups, because it doesn't matter. I just queue up, I'm put together in a random group, don't really have to say a word, beat the boss, get spit out, rinse and repeat. Player interaction is one of the core, aspects of Ashes of Creation, and they want you to have to be able to interact with players to get things done, to do things, and do things all around the world. Now, the next pillar that we have is player agency. Player agency is defined many different ways, but if I was to just really quickly sum it up, it would be the ability for the player to kind of change and make decisions and make an impactful decision. Does his or her decisions make any impact on the actual world? And then, do they have enough information to, again, make some changes and be reactive with the world? So a good example of something that isn't much player agency is like most theme park MMOs that kind of put you on a track and you go forward and you kind of, you're interacting with the story, but your choices don't really mean much. That's not really much player agency, whereas there are some other games that really allow you to make changes that will in turn affect not only the world but your player's progression and things of that nature. So they really want player agency to be something that is highly defined. Now, again, player agency is another topic in of itself that takes quite a long time to kind of go through. So if that explanation that I just gave you isn't clear, I'm going to have some links down below that more thoroughly actually explain this particular pillar. And the final pillar is all about risk versus reward. I think that's pretty self-explanatory, but it's essentially, if I do riskier activities, will I be rewarded more for said activities, as opposed to if I do something simple, will I not get as much for it? So there should be some element of that risk versus reward that is present within the game. So that essentially sums up the 5 pillars that Ashes of Creation is based off of. So with that, let's go ahead and just quickly jump into the Ultima Online great aspects, or the things that made Ultima Online great as respective to these pillars that Ashes of Creation is striving to be and do. So the first pillar, engaging story. Ultima Online, obviously Ultima came from the series Ultima and had a pretty wide and overarching story, specifically with the 8 virtues, I think it was 8 virtues that are contained within the game that players strive to kind of be and do. Now, the strength in Ultima Online wasn't the story that was put forward by the company or by the developers of Origin Studios, but it was more the strength of the story was all about the players and what they created. You know, over time, what happened was, you know, guilds would rise up. There would be, you know, different organizations that would rise up. You would get used to seeing different types of people, and there would be various points and bits of drama that would occur throughout the time. And that was really integral in developing Ultima Online. There was a reason to log in every day because there was that story. You were part of the story. You were creating the story as it went on. It's very similar, if those of you have played EVE Online, it's very similar to that concept. Huge community, huge going-ons, huge happenings, and it was all created by the players. So the story was there, but it was more story that was narrated by the players and was specific to that. Now the next tenet, Reactive World, the world changed. The world changed in many different ways. What you would see happen because of like the housing system that Ultima Online had, where you could build houses anywhere, there would be other little villages that would pop up all over the place. I know on my shard, the Great Lake shard, there was, you know, a popular crossroads area. There was a popular area outside of various dungeons that would provide, you know, different types of resources. And there were, you know, various areas that just popped up, and the world kind of reacted to that. So you could safely go to one area because you knew it was controlled by one guild, whereas if you went to the crossroads where there was, you know, various fighting going on, there was a lot of player killing guilds there, you know, it was not as safe. You could not go somewhere, and that could change from time to time as certain guilds would fall out of power and other guilds would come up. So the world was highly reactive in that respect. Ultima Online was really set about player interaction. That was really a key portion of the game. There were no auction houses. You couldn't go and sell your goods. And this was even before they made these little vendors available that could sell things. You had to peddle your goods. If you wanted to sell to somebody else, you had to sit there, create a macro, and shout it out to people within the vicinity, and run around, sell stuff to other people, get your gold, you know, save it up, things of that nature. You couldn't just willy-nilly go out, you know, post it on the auction house, set it and forget it. You had to interact with people every day. If you wanted to, you know, go into a populated dungeon and work, you had to work with people. There were various programs that people used, IRC, there was MIRC, sorry, ICQ, man, I'm forgetting a bunch of them, but there were so many ways that you could communicate, and people were forced to kind of interact and communicate with one another. And so it was an aspect that was, I guess, widely overlooked, is that player interaction, and you did that in your everyday life. Now, player agency. Ultima Online was rife with player agency, that other core tenet of Ashes of Creation. You could do whatever it is you wanted to do. If you wanted to be a tailor, if you wanted to bake goods, spend your time in town, try and earn your money up that way, you could do that. If you wanted to become a murderer, you could do that. Become a thief, do it. Blacksmith, you name it. Tamer, whatever you wanted to do, you could do it. If you wanted to build a village, you wanted to, you know, do all sorts of things, and players got really creative in what they did. You could be what you wanted to be. You could do what you wanted to do. And as the world changed and interacted, you would then have to choose how you would react to it. And do various things like that. So there was a ton of player agency that was present within the game. And the final tenet, risk versus reward. Ultima Online was all about risk versus reward in terms of how it was actually set up. Again, you couldn't just walk from point A to point B in the map without having to worry about a player killer potentially coming along, killing you and taking all of your stuff, or something of the like. If you were sitting there mining and you had just filled up with iron ore and just smelted it, you had to worry about thieves. You had to worry about player killers coming along. Ultimately, the more prosperous the place, the more dangerous it was to actually be. So that was inherently kind of built into the system, and what, you know, kind of resulted in the game. All right, so at this point, I think I've given you guys a really good primer on what Ultima Online brought to the table. Now I want to go ahead and give you and tell you what were the problems that Ultima Online experienced. If this game was so great, why did it kind of go to the wayside? And you know, what is it, or how is it relevant to Ashes of Creation? So with that, let's just go ahead and start on that. So before I start talking about, the problems of Ultima Online, let me give you a quick story of my interaction. So my first server, I joined Ultima Online in September of 1997, started on the Atlantic server, there were lag issues, kind of waited it out, ended up being on the Great Lakes server. I started out as a tailor. I got some help from a person who kind of showed me how to gain money from tailoring. So as I was kind of figuring out my way, I ended up becoming a tailor, making a ton of money, purchasing some like a full set of ring mail from another player, a bunch of weapons and things like that, and then ended up kind of honing some of my skills that way. Long story short, I ended up getting PK'd multiple times. Like, that was kind of the way of the world. You had to work with the danger that was kind of out there. And then finally, one time, I ended up, banding up a bunch of players, was like, hey, let's go get these guys. They're at the dungeon. Let's do our thing. We go there and we meet the player killers. I go charging in, and the people that I had brought with me, they went the other direction. And so it was me against, 4 or 5 dreadlords at that point. They killed me without any issue or whatsoever. And so I'm on top of the bank, kind of, naked at that point, because again, Ultima Online was full loot. So I'm back there, kind of thinking, all right, how do I want to re-equip myself? And then Ballyhoo, who was the leader of one of these PK guilds called the Drakul, teleported in. She recognized me as the one, who stayed at fought. She was like, hey, I noticed you like to fight, blah, blah, blah. Would you like to join us? And long story short, I ended up becoming a player killer as well at that time. So I kind of did the whole dissension into Dreadlord, and then becoming a Dreadlord, joining the Drakul, and hanging out in that, group and area. And they became essentially my guild, my gang members, etc. with. And that's what we did. We PK'd, we controlled a certain area, and that was life. That was, kind of how we did. And that's how I become a player killer. And I made more money in one day player killing and killing other people, taking their stuff and selling it, than I did in probably 3 weeks, almost a month of just tailoring shirts. I would come back every day and tailor those goddamn shirts every single day, just, make money. And I thought I was making money then. When I started PKing, I realized the folly of my ways. I realized, oh my God, this is way more lucrative than doing that. And so that's what I did. I player killed for a while and, became a player killer. So roughly during this time, what was happening kind of in the larger Ultima Online world was there were a lot of people who were complaining, who were essentially like, yo, being a bad guy is far more lucrative than it is to be the good guy. I mean, like I said, you could earn way more money player killing than you could by legit means, or I mean, it was a legit mean, but by doing the goody two-shoes way. And so people began to complain to Richard Garriott, the creator. They're like, yo, you got to do something about this. Player killers are rampant. They're going crazy. And I remember his response was something along the lines of, hey, this is Ultima Online. These are the these are the virtues. Practice them. You guys got to become the good guys. And that was the rise of the anti-player killing kind of movement. And at first it was nothing. The Dreadlords smacked down the Great Lords without any problem. They were just far more experienced, stronger, and just better organized in general. But as time went on, anti-player killers, Great Lords became better and better and better, to the point where now we are having full-scale wars between Great Lords and Dreadlords. And it got to the point where Dreadlords were getting outnumbered and were losing, and essentially had to band together to form, the Great Lord or Dreadlord Alliance, and they went up against the Great Lords, and it became a huge, massive battle, and everything was fine and hunky-dory. And that was one of the greatest things about Ultima Online. The world kind of reacted, and everyone reacted to the things that were going on and adjusted kind of based off of that. So let's talk about the problems that it had. Well, all right, so in that story, what I just told you, as Richard Garriott listened to the complaints that people had, he was basically like, yo man, you gotta follow the virtues. That was all fine and dandy when there were no other options to play. At the time, Ultima Online was the only game in town that you could realistically play. Again, there were some others like Meridian 59. There weren't any serious contenders to UO. UO was the top dog. It was the only dog in town. Around the time that EverQuest was released, what started happening is people realized, especially people who were being PK'd, realized, hey, I don't have to deal with this. I can just go play a game that has better graphics and is more conducive to an environment where I don't have to worry every 2 seconds about being killed by another player or having to adjust to that. And that's what people ended up doing. They ended up leaving and going to play these other games because they were more friendly to the overall environment. Like if you really think about it, as much as I love Ultima Online, it was a really cutthroat environment. It was an environment that was brutal. It was downright just barbaric in some ways, but you got used to it because it was the only game in town. And once people realized that it wasn't the only game in town and you could do something else, well, they left. Ultima Online kind of did some things to help stem people leaving, like there was one point where they introduced Trammel, which was a separate world that you could go into, and you couldn't attack other players in it. And that was kind of in response to like EQ betas and stuff like that, when UO or Origin realized that they were going to start bleeding players by this, and they started introducing these concepts. So that was kind of the beginning of the end. Once other options and once the MMO world started fleshing out and more options became available, people naturally just started leaving. Now, another reason why Ultima Online had issues is nowhere was safe. When I say nowhere was safe, I don't mean just outside of town nowhere was safe. I mean even inside of town. Thieves were rampant in town, because the karma system, if you stole something, you could only ever, go down a certain level, but it would never be to the point where you'd be kicked out of town. So thieves were rampant everywhere. And worse yet, there was like thieves that would appear, and I say worse yet, even though I was one of them at one point. You could create your thief in a way that if somebody retaliated against you, you were allowed to kill them and defend yourself. And so you would steal from somebody, they would attack you, you would defend yourself and kill them and get their stuff for doing that. So it's like, it was not even town was safe. You had to deal with the rampant thieves, and then outside you had to deal with the rampant PKers. So it was overall just brutal. Now, in all this, it was boring to be the good guy. That was an essential problem. All of this player killing, all of this, these murderers that are kind of running around, it was far more lucrative to be a PKer. It was far more fun to be a PKer. You were engaging in, more in guild politics, and it just was, more interactive. Whereas being a good guy, like I explained earlier, there's only so many tailored shirts that you can make over and over again. It becomes an actual kind of job, if you will, and it's not a fun one. So so it's basically, you work your job in real life, or you go to school, and then you come back and you digitally sit there and farm, and that's your virtue for the thing. And so being a good guy simply wasn't fun. And being a player killer was just far more fun and lucrative. The graphics were also an issue with Ultima Online, and they were arguably dated even when they came out. They weren't that great when they came out, but they quickly became dated, and other games really put it to shame. So if graphics and things were your thing, then Ultima Online almost definitely did not appeal to you. So the final problem really stemmed around bugs, duping, and exploits. It got so bad in Ultima Online, bugs, duping, and exploits, to the fact that there were a lot of people who looked forward to patch day for Ultima Online because it meant there's a slew of different bugs and, drastic, balance changes that would occur. And if you could find out what it was, you could exploit it to your heart's desire. You would not be banned, you would not be punished, and you would gain a leg up that would last a lifetime. Like when the archery patch was released, if you knew what you were doing and you had prepared for it, you were a murdering machine on day one, and you were king of the top. If you had figured out the exploit for, duping, then that's what you did. You duped and you created a fortune. There's no need to go ahead and do it, and you just ran amok. And so there were many things of that nature that were just straight up problems, and Origin did not do a good job they let it flow basically, and there were very little repercussions for duping and exploiting in general. So that in a nutshell kind of covers what the main, I consider, issues and failing points of Ultima Online were. Now, Ultima Online at this stage will never be duplicated. You simply can't do it in this kind of climate and age. People won't put up with the things that happened in it. The game won't grow itself based kind of on that whole premise that Ultima Online was based on. But Ashes of Creation is set to kind of capture the best of what UO was, while at the same time kind of addressing the problems that Ultima Online ultimately had with it. You think about it, things like making it so you can choose to be a murderer in Ashes of Creation. You can choose to kill people wantonly, but there's a penalty to pay for it. You know, it's risk versus reward, that whole kind of aspect for it. Very similar karma system, but again, slightly tweaked to kind of avoid the problems that Ultima Online had, while at the same time introducing that player interaction, which is arguably, to me, one of the most important, if not the most important part of an MMORPG, massive multiplayer online role-playing game. So those things that, you know, are there, the problems, Ashes is set to essentially solve, if you will, while, you know, kind of putting itself within a new thing. So when people, specifically Ultima Online players, heard about Ashes of Creation, many of us became just so excited because it felt like the resurgence of this type of a game, open world game, sandbox type of a game, where players kind of dictate the whole thing. The closest thing to UO that is available today would probably be something along the lines of EVE Online. The problem is it's more of a space game rather than the fantasy kind of set in, and that doesn't appeal to a lot of people, to a good amount of people, but obviously a good enough amount. But sorry, kind of went off on a tangent there. So yeah, so hopefully this video kind of gives you guys a little bit more of an explanation, or gave you guys a little bit more of an explanation for why Ultima Online players are so excited for Ashes of Creation. So that's pretty much it, guys. Let me know what your thoughts are, and you know, if this was helpful at all. Thank you guys, take care of yourselves, and you guys have a great day. Alpha Soul out.